Morning. Welcome to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. This is February 23, 2019. Our speaker this morning is Nick Samoljuk. Okay. He is a friend of mine for many decades, and we're happy to hear him present his case on why I am a pro-life Adventist. And he will be joined by Andrew Michelle.
Yes, correct.
And so we will benefit from hearing from both of them.
Right.
And we look forward to a good time, Nick.
Okay, thank you very much.
Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for the Sabbath. Thank you for Nick and for Andrew. Thank you for new life. We pray that we'll be increasingly mindful about how we can protect and preserve and promote the new lives among us. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Good morning. First, I want to thank Dr. Larson for giving us the opportunity to present the biblical view of abortion. And I want to emphasize, we will be talking about this topic from the point of view of the Bible. So, I hope you understand. We received from Dr. Larson 5 questions, and we intend to follow them in our presentation. In order to facilitate answering these questions, I have a special visitor. His name is Andrew Michelle. Very unique last name, especially. And he flew from, believe it or not, he was so kind. I asked him, and he said, no problem, I will be there. So he flew from the Philippines to be for this special occasion.
Amen.
Thank you.
I met him for the first time 2 years ago in this building. He was the main speaker at the Advent Hope group that meets every Sabbath in the main Centennial Building auditorium. He is very interested in the Bible. I have asked him, instead of me introducing all his background and experience, I've asked him to do that. So please, Andrew, say something about your background and experience.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to join with you this morning. For several years, I was a volunteer, doing volunteer work, missionary work through Adventist volunteer services in several countries in Central America, South America, East Africa, and recently for 5 years, I lived in Southeast Asia doing volunteer outreach projects at a girls' orphanage and at a refugee camp on the border of Thailand and Myanmar. Currently, I live in downtown Manila, Philippines. My wife, I'm waiting for my wife to finish her residency. She's on the 4th year of her residency, OB-GYN. She's an OB-GYN physician at an Adventist hospital. There's a book here in the library, the Loma Library. It was published by the Review and Herald that has more stories of my background. If you want more information, I can give that to you afterwards. This topic is very interesting to me. I started studying this topic a few years ago, came into contact with Nick. He's been an extremely kind, helpful friend of mine, so it's a pleasure to be here with Nick this morning. Thank you very much.
We are ready to start with question number 1. The first question we received from Dr. Larson. Quote, what does the Bible explicitly and implicitly say to you about the practice of abortion? I have asked my friend, because of the study of his study of the Bible. I have asked him to answer question 1 and 2, and I'll be answering questions 3, 4, and 5.
Okay. Well, if you don't mind, is it okay for me to stand up? Okay, excellent. I don't want to sit for the slide. So question number 1 is, what does the Bible explicitly and implicitly say about the practice of abortion? Now, this topic is very important at the beginning to define your terms, to get a definition for the words that you will be using. So, and of course, the most important word that we're going to define here is abortion. What is this word and what does it mean? I'm going to take a definition from Google. Google, if you type in definition of abortion, it says the deliberate termination of a human pregnancy. Pregnancy, if you get the word pregnant, it says of a woman having a child or young developing in the uterus. There are other definitions which you can find. For example, medicinenet.com, abortion in medicine. An abortion is the premature exit of the products of conception, the fetus, fetal membranes, and placenta from the uterus. So the question we're asking this morning is this is about the size of a 7-month fetus. The question we have this morning is this: is this merely a tumor or placental contents or tissue? Is this a random clump of cells, or is this a human child? That is the question we want to answer. And because this morning's topic is about the Bible, this is very important. We'll be trying to define what this is from a biblical perspective, to get that definition. Now this is important because as Adventists, our fundamental belief number 1 states that the Holy Scriptures are the supreme, authoritative and infallible revelation of His will. Does the Bible define the unborn? Does the Bible define the nature of this thing right here? If it does, how does it do so? And very importantly, is there any consensus or unanimity in the Scriptures concerning this definition? A very common pro-life Bible verse, you hear this all the time, especially in the news or whenever people talk on this topic, comes from Psalm 139, 13 and 14, which says, "For you formed my inward parts, you covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well." Now, this is a very common pro-life Bible verse. But I would like to argue or present the idea that this Bible verse by itself is not helpful in explicitly defining the nature of this 7-month fetus. It doesn't tell us exactly what that is. It may do so implicitly, but not directly. Other Bible verses which you may be familiar with, many times in the Bible, there are phrases that a woman is found with child of the Holy Spirit. The translations in your English is both in the Old Testament and New Testament will use this phrase, with child. I would like to also argue that this also is not very helpful in defining the nature of what this is. For example, in the Greek, in that verse it says, in the Greek it says, en gastri, and I believe it's pronounced echo, which literally means in Greek, in or on. Gastri is the stomach, belly, or abdominal area. That's where we get the word gastritis and such familiar other words. And echo is the verb to have or to hold. So when the Bible says she was found with child, it literally says this woman was holding something, or she had something in her abdominal area. That, again, does not tell us explicitly what it is. The translators use the word child, but the actual authors did not. Well, thankfully, there are some verses in the Bible that do give us a hint of definition or help us understand the nature of the unborn. Genesis 25:22, "But the children struggled within her." Now, this word children is the Hebrew word banim, which is the plural form of the Hebrew word ben, which means son or child. It's translated in the book of Genesis. Moses uses the word banim at least 20 times and always refers to sons and daughters. And he uses the same word for unborn children. For example, the word ben is the singular form, and the word yamin means right hand. You know the name Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. There's another verse, Isaiah 37, Isaiah 37:3, and they said to him, thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of trouble and rebuke and blasphemy. For the what? For the children have come to birth. Again, it's the same word, banim, a very physical, a very graphic word that's used to define both unborn children and born children. There's no distinction there between their geographical location. This same verse is also found in 2 Kings 19, verse 3. Another verse, Ruth 1:11, Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still what? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Again, a very physical, graphic word defining the unborn with the same words that are used to define born children. There's several other verses. I'm not going to go through all of them today for the sake of time. Genesis 25, Isaiah, 2 Kings, children. Ruth 1:11, sons. Hosea 12:3. They use the word brothers. It's the same word used in the story of Cain and Abel. Am I my brother's keeper? And the unborn in 12:3 are defined as brothers. Exodus chapter 21, verse 22. The word yeled is the same word used for child, son, or youth. Luke chapter 1, verse 41 and 44. The physician Luke, when he had to choose a word to define what was in Elizabeth, define the unborn, he used the word brephos. And the word brephos is the same word to define what was in the manger. So when Luke chose a word to define the unborn for both born and unborn, he used the same word without distinction. This is a baby. Luke 1, 41 and 44. So there are plenty evidences, both in the Old and New Testament, that the authors, when they had to choose words to define the unborn, they chose to define them as whole, complete, living human children. But there's one verse I think it should really capture our attention, especially as Seventh-day Adventists, and that comes from Luke chapter 1, verse 36. And it says, now indeed Elizabeth, your relative, has also what? Conceived a son. They use the Greek word huios or huion, which is a word for born and unborn, for sons or daughters, in her old age. And this is now the 6th month for her, who was called barren. Now this verse is particularly important and significant because Luke is citing from the angel Gabriel. And this is very significant because this is not a human author. Gabriel says in Luke chapter 1 to the priest Zacharias, I stand in the presence of God. And he even told Zacharias, because you did not believe my words, you will be stricken with muteness. And just a few verses later, he tells Mary, Elizabeth has conceived a son. So an angel from the presence of God tells humanity the unborn is a son from the moment of conception. Now, Gabriel is very important to us as Adventists because I'm quite a new Adventist. I was baptized in 2005, but I think it's fair to say that our identity as Adventist Christians is largely based on the books of Daniel and Revelation. But it was Gabriel who came to Daniel and gave him understanding for the visions. And it was also Gabriel, we are told in the spirit of prophecy, that helped John to experience what he would write down as the book of Revelation. So Daniel and Revelation are to a great degree a result of this help or assistance of Gabriel. If we take Daniel so seriously and Revelation so seriously, we should also take Gabriel seriously in the book of Luke when he had to address what are the unborn and define them as whole, complete, living human children. And we have that here in our fundamental belief, number 4. Forever truly God, he, Jesus, became also truly human. It's amazing that our church defines the unborn as truly human. He was conceived of the Holy Spirit. They are defined as truly human from the moment of conception. So it is my conclusion that our church fundamental belief is fully consistent with the definitions that we find throughout Scripture in the Old and New Testament. There are many indirect, implicit evidences in the Bible that I don't think it's necessary for the sake of time to go through all these, but I'll just list a few. Children are a blessing, Psalm 127, verse 3, and it's the same word, banim. Banim are a blessing. God has a plan for the preborn, Jeremiah 1:5. God gives them names in the womb. God deserves praise for creating in the womb. Sabbath keeping necessitates respect for created life. and the importance of positive prenatal care. There are many other themes and evidences, but these are just an example of other direct, indirect, implicit evidences. Something else to consider is the importance of intentional versus unintentional. This is key when discussing the topic of abortion. It is very important to make a distinction between intentional abortion and unintentional abortion, and I want to list 5 circumstances that we are aware of. Unintentional, mother's physical life. Intentional abortion would be rape, incest, handicapped, disabled children, or congenital defects, and mother's, quote, health. In cases of a mother's physical life, like rare cases like eclampsia or ectopic pregnancy, when the woman comes into a hospital and she's in a life and death situation, the intent of the physician is to save life, to save the mother's life, and if possible, the life of the unborn child. It is not the intent to go into the woman's body and to terminate the pregnancy or to kill the child through the act of abortion. The intent is to save life. Sometimes the life is saved, and other times it's not. For example, in ectopic pregnancy, it's often in the first half of the pregnancy. The child grows in the fallopian tube, and it bursts the tube, and the doctors must perform an immediate salpingectomy, or there will be hemorrhagic shock, and then the mother will die. And they deliver the child. Of course, it's not viable, and unfortunately, it does not live. In other cases like eclampsia, where there's hypertension, I was speaking to an OB/GYN physician at a conference, and she told me a story that one day a mother came to the hospital and she had extreme eclampsia, and she died as soon as she got to the hospital. And so the doctors opened her up and took the child out. Unfortunately, because the child had been in there for a few minutes and the hypertension had compromised the oxygen supply to the child only lived 2 or 3 days. And so they had to deliver the child. So in cases of mother's physical life, it is the intent is to save life. In all the other cases, very sad, very troubling, and I'd like to give more details, but the key word is intentional. And I would like to present evidence that we Adventists understand very clearly the distinction between intentional and unintentional. And I would like to draw your attention this morning. For example, here's Ryan Baumberger, Pam Stenzel, Trayvon Clifton, and Rebecca Kiesling. These beautiful people all have something in common. They were all conceived through rape. And to intentionally kill or terminate their pregnancy would be intentional, not accidental. Here is Dean Cullinan. His mother was hit in the head and knocked unconscious with a vodka bottle, and she was brutally raped while she was unconscious. Dean Cullinan was conceived as a result of that rape. Today, he is now a theology student at Weimar. He joined the Adventist church a few years ago, and he's studying for the ministry. But even though he was conceived in such horrible, terrible circumstances, God has turned that curse into a blessing. Here's a Nick Vujicic, who no arms, no legs, but he gave a talk. He said, "I'm so glad that my parents did not know that I had these terrible defects, because it may have been recommended to terminate the pregnancy early, but God can use people even if they have congenital defects." Jesus was presented with a case in John chapter 9. The disciples saw a man born blind, and they said, "Jesus, what about this man? He was born blind. Was it his parents' sin or his sin?" And Jesus said, "Neither, but that the works of God may be glorified in him." So it's perfectly possible for God to work in anyone's life, no matter their background. But our official statements from October 9, 1992 on euthanasia, care for the dying, I highly recommend spending time reading it, but there are 2 significant statements in there. It says, number 1, Seventh-day Adventists believe that allowing a patient to die by foregoing interventions that only prolong suffering and postpone death is, keyword, morally different from actions that have as their primary, what's that word? Intention of directly taking of life. And it says later, Seventh-day Adventists do not practice mercy killing. They are opposed to active euthanasia. The intentional, that's that key word. This is so important right here. This is the word. Intentional taking of the life of a suffering or dying person. And I want you to notice something very carefully. I actually didn't notice this until just a few days ago when I was underlining this. We cite from Exodus 20:13. Can you tell me what verse? What is 20:13 in Exodus? Yeah, thou shalt not kill. That's the sixth commandment. We Adventists teach that to intentionally take the life of a human being, even if they are sick and suffering, is a violation of the sixth commandment. So this is very serious issue, very serious. So question number one, summary. The Bible is authoritative. The Bible defines the unborn as whole, complete, living human beings. Number three, Adventists claim the sixth commandment as prohibiting the intentional taking of human life, even if they are sick and dying. Moving on to question number two, what is your understanding of the history of Adventists and abortion? I'm just going to go through this briefly. Adventist history pioneers. There are 5 important points to be aware of. When our church began, the Adventist pioneers unanimously defined the unborn as living human children. They always use words children, sons, babies, brothers. They use the same language of the Bible. Point number 2, they condemned abortion as a violation of the sixth commandment. They condemned other Protestant denominations for supporting abortion. I'll give evidence for that in just a minute. They published anti-abortion sermons by non-Adventists. So we had people who were not Adventists. We published their sermons in our journals. I'll give evidence for that as well. And point number 5, they publicly showed sympathy and support for anti-abortion legislation. I would like to draw your attention to this timeline here from 1840 to 1900. In the year 1847, the American Medical Association was founded. And 10 years later, I believe it was May of 1857, Dr. Horatio Storer of the American Medical Association founded what became known as the Physicians' Crusade Against Abortion, who openly legislated and advocated for legislation to protect unborn children. And that took place between 1857 to about the 1880s. And over time, as a result of their efforts, abortion became illegal in all of the states except for Kentucky, where the state courts had outlawed the practice anyway. And the SDA Church was founded in 1863. So we were officially founded right during this time. The church was surrounded by these people, public people, who were advocating to make this illegal. So they were probably very well aware of this. And the Health Reformer in 1868, this is a monthly health journal published by Adventists. The editor was Dr. Horatio Lay. I'd like to read the entire article, but you can look this up online, or I can give you more information later. But here's one significant quote. He says, "Child murder, both before and after birth, is a regular and terrible to tell, vastly extensive business. And it is known to newspaper publishers that its advertising patronage pays so much more money than any other. Whole pages are sold at once by the largest and most popular what? Religious newspapers in this city and country for such nefarious purposes." He's using very strong language. It is not in the Herald and Sunday Mercury alone that such advertisements are found. They are in the most orthodox and widely read of the religious newspapers. Now, when I read that, I thought, this is astounding. Number one, because many Protestant denominations were openly using their religious journals to advertise for abortion or abortion-inducing drugs. But most importantly, Adventists knew this. They knew what was going on, and they publicly and openly spoke against that. I think that's a very important point that we should remember from Adventist history. Historian James Moore, who wrote the book Abortion in America, he talks about how these physicians were wanting the Protestant denominations to support their cause. They wanted them to speak out against what they believed was the immorality of abortion and the importance of saving unborn children. And he makes this statement that it wasn't until many years that the first Protestant leader spoke up. His name was the Reverend John Todd. Page 187. He publicly condemned abortion in an article entitled Fashionable Murder, which the Congregationalist and Boston Recorder, a prestigious journal, published in 1867. Reverend John Todd was a Congregationalist. Now, 1867 is really neat, because watch what happens in 1867. The Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, June 25th, 1867, under the editorship of Uriah Smith, in this same journal, he publishes John Todd's article. So John Todd, a non-Adventist, his article against abortion was published in an Adventist magazine. Now, I am born and raised in Washington State, in a very pro-abortion state. There's a Planned Parenthood just a few miles down from my house. And I did not become a Christian until much later in life. So I'm very well aware of how North Americans think, especially in Washington State. And now that I'm an Adventist, this is astounding. This would be equivalent to the Adventist Review today publishing an article by James Dobson or Franklin Graham condemning abortion. Now, could you imagine that? That seems almost something that would not happen. But that's what they did. That's what they did back then. I think it's really exciting, really interesting. Going to the next slide. So the SDA Church was founded, and these statements were made very early. The church began in 1863, and just 4 years later, even though we were a very small denomination, and we had so many challenges facing us, we had just endured the Civil War, we're still recovering from the Civil War, but Adventist leaders wanted to make it very clear to the world in no uncertain terms that in no way, shape, form, or degree would Adventists support abortion. They made that very clear, even at the very beginning. They made that point. And so this is important because the first line in our position says, many contemporary societies have faced conflict over the morality of abortion. But this was not so for the early Adventists. They were very unified. There was a consensus on this issue. They even said that as a class, Adventist Review and Herald, as a class, the medical profession have taken a noble stand. And society owes a debt of gratitude to Dr. Storer of Boston and for their efforts to make abortion illegal. That is an astounding comment made by Adventists showing sympathy and support for their efforts to protect unborn children. Abortion rights, I want to read this quote here. This is a book by Professor Marvin Olasky on page 164. He makes this very interesting statement. And if you want a picture of this later, I can show you, no problem. The physicians were calling for ministers to speak out, and it says, quote, that call largely went unanswered. And in 1893, Dr. J.H. Kellogg was still castigating ministers for their silence. Quote, every pulpit in the land should send out stirring and unmistakable tones, warning against the gross immorality of this practice, drawing vivid pictures of this cruelty and unnaturalness, and pronouncing anathemas upon its perpetrators. Kellogg used very strong language. And then he said the crime should be considered a just cause for church action to disfellowship, which was not, that's not surprising because Ellen White even made statements that if you voiced pro-slavery views, that was a reason to be disfellowshipped as well. But the reason I share that quote is because today, modern historians, when writing about this time, they cite from Adventists because Adventists were so loudly against it. I think that's quite remarkable considering how small we were of a denomination at that time. When you go to a Lamborghini museum, when you go to a showroom, you'll notice that there are no signs telling you not to scratch or damage the Lamborghini. Do you know why? Why? Because we all know that Lamborghinis are extremely valuable, and you can't even smudge the car, let alone try to destroy it. Ellen White was not silent about the value of an unborn child. She spent a lot of her time defining the nature of the unborn, its value, and the importance of positive prenatal care. I'll give you just one quote there. She wrote a lot. This is just one quote. She says, every drop of strong drink, speaking of pregnant mothers, taken by a pregnant mother to gratify appetite endangers not only the physical, the mental, but I find this interesting, but also the moral health of her child in utero, and is a direct sin against her Creator. So these are very strong words, and this will cause us to pause and think for a moment. This woman who's drinking alcohol, it is not her intent to drink the alcohol to hurt the child. She just wants to have a good time. But Ellen White says that we need to be careful about our actions, which may even indirectly hurt an unborn child. So this raises an important question. If it is so bad to indirectly or unintentionally hurt a child, then how much more worse is it to directly, with intent, take that child's life? That's far more serious. If it's so wrong to inject toxins into the body, which may lessen the mental or moral health, then how much more wrong is it to inject, for example, digoxin directly into that child's mind to facilitate its early death and abortion? These are important questions that I think we need to answer and wrestle with. Moving forward 50, 60, 70 years, you're probably familiar with the story of the paper published in Ministry Magazine, August 1991 by George Gaynor. I believe he presented this at the International Abortion Conference in 1988, held here at Loma Linda. I'll summarize this. The church in 1970-71 accepted abortion because of the incidents happening in our hospitals, starting in Castle Rock and Hawaii and others. And we accepted abortion in 1970. We came out with a second set of guidelines which remained unpublished, and for many years, as I understand it, just going from public, I don't know all the history and background, but just going from the public, what has been published, it was not really much of an issue. For about 15, 16 years, Adventists were largely unaware of the 1971 policy until about the 1985, 1986. There were protests outside Adventist hospitals. Mostly, I understand, the Washington Post covered it at our Shady Grove and Washington Adventist hospitals, just down the street from the GC and NAD. And that created a huge uproar. The issue of abortion was agitated in our church, which resulted in people talking about it, the abortion conference here at Loma Linda, and later what resulted in the 1992 official position, which we now have today. Now, throughout the history of our church, this position and related documents explaining what Adventists think about it presents a new concept. There's a new concept in the history of our church looking at abortion, and that is the concept that abortion is an act of religious liberty or freedom of conscience. It is something that is sacred and protected by our understanding of religious liberty. Well, this raises an important question, because we Adventists believe that religious liberty is freedom to believe. It is religious freedom, not just any freedom. It is religious in nature, and is defined for his or her choice to worship. So religious liberty is concerned with worship, which raises a question that I think needs to be answered, and I'm not aware of any attempt to seriously answer this in any Adventist publications. If abortion is a matter of religious liberty, and religious liberty is concerned with worship, then how is killing a child in utero an act of worship? We're probably familiar enough with the Bible to know that the Bible does not deny that there are times and places where killing children was part of a worship, but that definitely was not God's plan, and that was definitely not approved, and that was definitely part of people who had strayed so far from God's Word that they began to develop these ideas. So this is a serious question. Another question that needs to be answered is, what is the biblical principle distinguishing a baby born 2 months premature from a 7-month fetus, making it a crime to kill the first, but merely an exercise of personal freedom to destroy the second? So here we have a 7-month fetus, and if it is born premature, you can't kill it, because that would be a crime. But if a woman is 7 months pregnant, she can terminate the pregnancy, and that is protected by freedom of choice. But where is the biblical principle to make that distinction? The Adventist teaching, as I understand it, on abortion is founded upon this principle of religious liberty or freedom of conscience. And that's a nice theology or idea or way of explaining it. But abortion, by definition, is a physical procedure. It is a medical surgical act. That doctor or whoever performs the abortion, he needs the objective standard to apply this theological framework. He needs an objective standard to determine, am I committing infanticide or am I protecting freedom of conscience? Which one am I doing? And to this day, I am not aware that our church has ever produced that important evidence. This is absolutely crucial that we have this, because at the same time, we Adventists also say we have the End It Now initiative to end now violence against men, women, and especially children. So we have, as a church, a sense of urgency to respond to violent situations. And so I would like to submit today that we should be using our mind to look for this evidence so that we can know, is it freedom of conscience to end the life, or is it a religious liberty issue, or is it infanticide? There's a quote I would like to end with here from How Much is a Fetus Worth by Dr. Jack Prevention. I believe some of you may be familiar with his books and material. He wrote in this article published in Ministry Magazine, January 1984, he makes an interesting comment. He says, for example, we quite legitimately refuse a woman absolute rights over her newborn infant. She has what? She has no freedom to destroy that child or even to abuse it. This, I love this, the newborn has a say, even if the rest of us temporarily have to speak for it. We need to speak for newborn children. Even Jack Pravancha understood very clearly that no woman, anyone has a freedom to hurt or injure someone else, especially a child. That freedom does not cover those type of actions. And that those who are weak, those who are vulnerable, they need us to speak up on behalf of it. And so that's why it's important. That's why the presentation this morning, from a biblical perspective, I'm fully aware of how courts in our land or our culture defines the unborn. But as a Seventh-day Adventist, because the Bible is authoritative, I'm concerned, and we should be concerned of the biblical definition for the unborn. And the Bible defines the unborn as whole, complete, living human children, and we should protect their lives. Thank you. Let's go to question number 3.
Okay, Nick, could you just hold for a minute, please? I'm going to exercise my right as a moderator here and ask us to come again on another time for Nick's presentation. We've had a lot here, and I think we should have some opportunity to interact with Andrew.
Sure.
And then, because he's clear from the Philippines, and then we'll re-invite you, Nick, to present your answers to 3, 4, and 5, okay? As soon as we can schedule that. Who knows? We may be able to arrange for Andrew to come back. Let's check on the money on that. But I think it's important for us to have a chance to discuss this much. And if I would interject this, it would be that a lot of us find the Wesleyan quadrilateral a very helpful way of thinking through things. And what we have heard this morning is a very fine presentation on the first two, that is Scripture and tradition, Scripture and history. But we still have reason and experience to consider into the future. And we will do that. But I very much would like us to take full advantage of the fact that Andrew has come all this way from the Philippines. And I must commend you for doing what I asked you to do, and that is affirmatively to present your own position without castigating anybody else's position. So thank you, Andrew. You did very, very well, and I'm grateful for that. So, and I'm sorry, Nick, to cut you off this way, but
That's okay.
we've been friends, and I hope this friendship will last after I've done this. Okay, now I would like to make a couple of suggestions. Andrew mentioned the abortion conference we held some years ago, which resulted in a book. And one of the things I did as the leader of that conference was to ask people to make recommendations to the presenters that would help the presenters make their own case more persuasively. So what I would like to know is, what recommendations do you have for Andrew that would help Andrew make his case even more persuasively than he already has? This is not, I think, the time for us to say, well, Andrew, we don't believe on this or that or another thing. We all know that we all have different views. But Andrew would be most benefited if he went back to the Philippines with some ideas as to how he could make his case more persuasively. Not how he could take on our case, but how he could make his case more persuasively. Is that okay?
Sure, thank you.
Now, and I would like, if in the doing of this, if you would take us back on your slides to the one which made the helpful distinction between the intentional and the unintentional. And without using fancy language, Andrews there has introduced the so-called principle of double effect, which is a very old and very persuasive line of argument that says there's a difference between a foreseen outcome and an intended outcome. And sometimes one intends one action, namely to save the life of the mother. One foreseeably anticipates the death of the fetus, but insofar as that is foreseen but not intended, it is acceptable. We see this in war. Insofar as one intends to obliterate non-combatant civilians, that's wrong. But the argument is, if one intends to aim at a military target and foreseeably but unintentionally some civilians lose their lives, that's arguably acceptable. So it's in that context, it's in the context of the ethics of war, that the distinction between foreseen and intended consequences emerged, and from there it has drifted into other areas of inquiry, such as abortion. So now, what he did was present that to us in far less technical language than one will find if one looks up on the internet the principle of double effect. But it's a very, very important way of handling this. Now, there was a chart near to this that, there we go. Okay, so this would be the position, this is the most persuasive position on the pro-life side, and it's especially seen in conservative Protestants and in official Roman Catholic thought. That is, under the principle of double effect, an abortion is permissible if it's necessary to save the mother's physical life. All right. Now, my suggestion is this. I think it would be helpful, Andrew, if in your next presentations, you would help us understand why rape, incest, handicapped, disabled children, and the mother's health are in every instance morally wrong. That's one thing. And secondly, I think it would be helpful next time you come, and I hope you come again, that you bring us 3 models.
Sure.
Okay? This is a 3rd trimester fetus. How about bringing us a 2nd trimester one and a 1st trimester one?
Okay, no problem.
Okay? Because the vast majority of abortions are done in the 1st trimester, and only those that are required to save the woman's life are done in the 3rd trimester, though it is true that Roe v. Wade allows 3rd trimester abortions. That is, it gives the states permission to outlaw 3rd trimester abortions unless those are necessary to save the mother's physical life, but it doesn't require the states to do so. As a matter of fact, each state has done so, but Roe v. Wade does not require them to do so. So, if we could have 3 models rather than 2, I think your position would be even more persuasive than it already is. Would you like to respond?
Yes, I personally am not aware of the principle of double effect or the Wesleyan.
Quadrilateral.
I'm sorry, I have not read about that. That's definitely something I'm going to look up. To respond, as far as I'm aware, for example, if I brought an embryo, or 1 week, or 37 weeks, it is all, my understanding, it's all the same, because the Bible, the angel Gabriel defined the unborn as humanity, a full living human child, from the moment of conception, and I'm not aware, maybe there is, I'm just not personally aware of any evidence in the Bible that there is a distinction in one's humanity depending on the age of gestation or after birth. I just see a straight line, clear, consistent definition of children, sons, babies, and brothers, born and unborn, whether 5 years old, 5 months old, 5 weeks old, 5 minutes before birth, or 5 days after conception, whatever point in timeline you would be. So that's this is just based on my understanding so far. Thank you.
All right, who has the next question or comment? Way in the back. Okay, here we go. I'll take it back there. And maybe, Nick, could you take the microphone off of your necktie and then share it back and forth with Andrew so he can be into the mic and then heard on the video as well. Here we go.
My name is Jonathan Zirkle. And my question is actually as much for you. I'm just wanting to learn as well. With this unintentional, my background is legal, and I studied the abortion issue at Georgetown, and we actually studied it more in terms of self-defense. And so we would put self-defense on the unintentional column, and then say impermissible on the right column. And I'm wondering if self-defense isn't just an easier way to think about it in terms of discussion. And the other question, or the other observation I was going to make that I think is really interesting, is that when you look at the different trimesters and everything, and we study, I took a medical ethics class, we spent a while studying this out, but it seems like the only qualitative difference, you can look at qualitative differences, and the big qualitative event that happens is conception. And then everything else is kind of a quantitative, slow movement. And the things that we value most as human beings, and our thoughts and our moral reasoning and all this other kind of stuff, they actually seem to happen sometime post-birth. And so there's no real qualitative decision you can make between any of the trimesters. So this is just a couple observations.
So, Jonathan, thank you very much. Let's see, who's next? All right, I'm sorry I ran away so fast. I would like to respond to Jonathan as I'm taking this over here, and that is, I do think the notion of self-defense might be a quicker way to get to the issue than the principle of double effect. I think the principle of double effect may take us back to the Middle Ages and back here in a way that's not all that helpful now. So I'll take your point on that. I would like to suggest that the qualitative difference occurs at implantation. And then from there we move forward, because I think that a conceptus that has not yet implanted, the clock has not yet started ticking for that new life. But that's a relatively minor response to you, because your overall point, as I understand it, is that there's no ethical difference as the pregnancy progresses. That from whether it's conception or transplantation, from the appropriate qualitative difference, from then on, the new life deserves equal protection. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Carlson. Reed.
Donna.
Okay.
No, I was just going to say that one thing that has always struck me is the difference between our position on infanticide or killing a child versus an invisible pregnancy. We don't see it because the child at that point is concealed by a covering of flesh. And it's when it's born and we actually look at something with arms and legs and eyes that open, it takes on a different, not just a visual difference, but in some sense a meaningful difference, just from the viewpoint of those of us who are looking outside. One issue I find, or one difficulty I find with determining that the development of moral reasoning or the ability to reason at all is the point at which a child becomes a person, is by that standard. And as I was just mentioning to Jonathan, some of the ancient societies believed that you could kill a child without moral, transgressing any moral point, but at any point. 5 years old, some suggested that a child could be killed up to the age of 5 without any disapprobation being applied, because that's the point at which you find out whether the child is smart enough or morally developed enough to make adult-type decisions. So I find it difficult to draw a precise line. And the difference between conceptus and implantation, that's kind of fuzzy, David. But beyond that, I think we just have difficulty deciding what the tipping point is. That's not to say anything, but just to point out it's difficult.
Okay, who's next? Way over here. As I get there, I would like to introduce the distinction between a possible life and a potential life. And it seems to me a single sperm or a single ovum is a possible human being, but not a potential one. To be potential means that one has the inner power within oneself to become what one typically would be unless something bad happens. But I'm going to have to learn more from Dr. Carlson, because it seems to me that conceptually, I should not have used that word, intellectually, the difference between conception and implantation is a big, big deal, and she's asked me to think of it as a more fuzzy matter, and so I need to learn more from her on that.
Thank you, Nick, for your presentation. I've known Nick for years, and I appreciate your passion. However, there are countries where girls are killed intentionally after birth because they want boys. There are places in the world, especially in third world countries, my mom had 12 children. You have women who have 7, 6 children. They cannot even produce milk for the last one. And they're pregnant with another one because they cannot say no. So if they find a way it becomes just a burden and a way to keep the other ones alive. There are plethora of reasons why some women may opt for an abortion. But I believe everyone knows in their heart, a baby, even the first day of conception, is a baby. If you leave left alone, you're going to have a child, not a monkey, not a table. I think everyone can accept that. But there are reasons. Just like David in Psalm 51 said, God, I've sinned against you alone, and my sin is always in front of me. Women, children in this country at 12, 13 can go have an abortion while they go to school without even telling the parents, and the school help them do that. So that child, when he's 34, when that child is 40, 30, can have such pain just thinking about it, because you change. You're not the same at 15 that you were at 25. I think to make your presentation more, how would I say, more valid, you should add something to women who in your audience may have had an abortion, to let them know there is grace.
Absolutely.
It's not just the religion says that and this and that and the other. That's all I would add. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, I hear two different things here, Andrew. One is that the note of grace ought to be sounded for those who have or are considering an abortion, one thing. Secondly, what do we say in those cases in other countries, particularly where people really need the relief of abortion because pregnancy occurs unwillingly and frequently?
The best way, let me see if I can answer both with one answer. I was born and raised in a very secular home. I've gotten in a lot of trouble at school. I got arrested by the police at the age of 16 for 7 kidnappings and armed robberies. I spent 10 years of my life in prison. While in prison, I read the Bible. I got out of prison and joined the Adventist Church in 2005. If I was in a very desperate situation monetarily, I don't think that there's any Adventist in the world that would make an exceptional circumstance for me to go rob again to provide for my needs. I know that that may not seem analogous to the situation of a woman, but morally, if euthanasia, if directly taken a life, is a violation of Exodus 20:13, then that's just as serious, according to James 2:10, as me go committing a robbery. Very, very sad situations, very tragic in different areas of the world. And this morning I would have loved to provide time to answer with the grace question, but I'm only limited to 15-20 minutes to do question 1 and 2. But that's a very valid, very important point, and I definitely sympathize. I just, for example, our Adventist church, I contacted the GC stewardship department. I said, are there any exceptional circumstances to withhold or redirect tithe? And do you know what their answer to me was? They said, biblically, absolutely not. I said, so my second question is this. If I must be a good steward with the tithe, and I cannot withdraw it for any circumstance, but a pregnant mother must also be a steward to her unborn child of an item much more, this is far more valuable than a Federal Reserve note, why does she have exceptional circumstances to withhold or redirect the child, but I can't do that to the tithe? And they didn't answer that question.
May I have one more word?
Sure.
Please. What are miscarriages? Is God performing abortions?
That's a great question, and I would rather not answer that right now because I would like to present a point-by-point scientific medical answer to that. As far as if your body performs, I'm speaking just off the top of my head, please go study this for yourself, but a miscarriage is an action of the body that's performed beyond your intent or direction or purpose. I mean, I don't see that analogous to intentional ending of life.
Just in answer to what Dave said, to give you feedback on your presentation,
Sure, thank you. Yeah, please.
I personally would leave out the examples of people who were so happy that they were not aborted that possibly could have been. Just giving, those kind of examples, it appeals to the emotions, but I don't think it adds to the whole idea of coming up with a concrete, guidelines.
Sure.
I mean, people on the other side could come up with lots of examples of people whose lives have been ruined by not having an abortion. So that's my feedback.
Yeah, that is a very valid and important point. And so I just want to highlight the sum and substance of my presentation. The main point was finding, I'm not aware of biblical evidence to answer that question of what defines the difference between freedom of conscience and committing a crime. It's just, I'm trying to just consider it from a very biblical perspective. Thank you. That's a very
Okay, here we come over to Rodney, I should say, Rodney Corker.
Again, just on feedback on the weighting of your presentation, would be that the implicit stuff is not that compelling. I'm sitting here wanting to be compelled towards a position. So I'm looking for the most explicit. And I think if you move to the most explicit as quickly as possible, I think, because lots of things are implicit in the Bible, I think that weighting would also help. I also found the historic Adventist positions more academic and therefore not helpful to a young girl who has the dilemma. She's in, focus on the young girl who, or woman, who is in the audience here, 3 months pregnant, and deciding whether to abort or not in today's world, today's moral world, whatever that means. She's the person that I would look for you to tailor, as you develop your presentation, to tailor the message to. And because that's what's happening and that's what agrees people, that's what the debate is about. It's not so much historic as it is contemporary morality. And how do you get to that point?
Thank you. My response?
If you want to, you don't have to.
Yeah, ask your question, Andrew, and then maybe you can
Go ahead,
answer my question too. I was just going to ask, my understanding was you were given these questions to present about the Adventist history, so it might not be part of your normal, it might be different depending on what audience you were presenting to. And that's what I was asking you, if that was the case, or if this would always be how you would present this issue.
I'm very hyper-conscious of, I try to be very hyper-conscious of time. I've learned, if I'm given 20 minutes to speak, I try to finish at 17 minutes. If I'm given an hour, I like to be done by 53 minutes and sit down. So I was given a very defined, limited, to cover a lot of information about the biblical definition and the history in just, my goal was 17, 18 minutes. I hoped that I stayed at least somewhat on time. And of course, there's other very important, valid points that I want to address. I just did not have that time this morning. So thank you very much. I apologize. I could not do that. Maybe another time.
Okay, no apologies needed or accepted, okay? I did ask that these 5 questions be answered, and one of them is the historical question. I take Rodney's point that a person facing the crisis of an unscheduled pregnancy may not be all that interested in the history of Adventist thought on this. That's a very, very good point. On the other hand, I asked him to do that, so it's my responsibility. Nick, you have just 30 seconds, and then we'll have the benediction.
I need 1 minute.
I don't know. Go ahead. Don't waste time talking to me. Go for it.
It's for the sake of fairness.
Go for it.
Because I was invited, and I didn't have a chance to talk. So
I know.
I need to share with you an anecdote.
Okay.
Many years ago, in Argentina, there was a student who was married with a young wife and a young baby. They were occupying a very tiny bachelor's apartment. It was winter, very cold. I had to deliver some papers to the man, to the student, and I went there to deliver the papers. He was not there. I noticed as I hand the papers to the wife, she was concerned. I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "I don't know what's happening, but every time I light the kerosene lamp, the light goes out." And she said, "I try again, and the light goes out." I said, I look around, and I noticed the window of the tiny apartment was closed. I said, "Why don't you open the window a little bit, let some oxygen in?" And she did that, and a miracle took place. She lighted the kerosene lamp, and the light stayed on. I said, "You know what? Your kerosene lamp needs oxygen, and your baby needs oxygen as well. I'm glad I got here on time before you retired for the night. Thank you, David Larson, because the church has deprived Adventist pro-lifers like Andrew Michel from oxygen since 1970.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm grateful because you have given some oxygen to this in defense of the unborn.
Okay, now, this is going to go on the internet, so they'll... Now, I hope it's not too defensive of me to say, Nick, I invited you, and you invited Andrew. So if he took up your time, you chatted up with him, not with me.
We have a handout.
Okay,
So I'll be standing by this door to give you a copy of the handout.
okay, and we will reschedule you, Nick, for answers 3, 4, and 5. All right, everybody, let's do the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen.